Hi, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about setting up a job queue entry to execute your CSM automation routines on a scheduled basis. We're also going to look at some advanced functionality that allows you to set up multiple job queues for your CSM automation. As part of any platform extension for CSM, Amazon, Shopify, Magento, whatever, CSM includes a series of what we call automation routines that instruct CSM to execute a particular API call or perform some other action to support CSM functionality. Each sales channel has its own set of automation routines, which can be automatically created or loaded as part of the whole sales channel setup process. So I open this, it's called the CSM automation list. You can see that I have separate sets of automation routines. I've got some Shopify channels, both a standard kind of Shopify online e-commerce channel, as well as a POS. And I'm also selling on Amazon as well. So I've got some channels for both the FBA and FBM fulfillment methods. And you can see how I have automation routines for each one of these channels. If you take a look at a line's description, you can generally get a pretty good idea of what it does. Retrieving orders from Shopify, retrieving payments, processing Amazon FBM and FBA orders, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of different configuration options for these records. You can indicate what order statuses they should execute against, how they should create Business Central sales orders. But that's really not the point of today's discussion. That content is covered as part of a separate video or tutorial. Because what we want to talk about today specifically is the scheduling of these automation routines. So out of the box, CSM includes automation code units that can be assigned to a Business Central job queue. If you're not familiar with the job queue, this is just standard Business Central functionality. It allows you to schedule the execution of something like a code unit or maybe a report on a recurring basis. So the idea here is that you would first set up a new job queue entry. You would then assign the provided CSM automation code unit to it. And then you would schedule it to execute on a recurring basis, let's say every hour. When the job queue entry runs, it will execute any of these CSM automation routines that are marked as scheduled and whose last run timestamp falls within the parameters of the scheduled frequency. Now, there are actually two out-of-the-box automation code units that are included as part of CSM. One for the execution of order management automations, and the other for the execution of listing management automations. These code units are configured to use specific values in the automation routine's code unit ID code field when determining whether or not to execute a routine. So for example, let's take order management. The order management automation historically has been configured to execute any automation with a code unit ID of order management default, or technically order MGT default. So when that job queue entry runs, it's going to process any line with that exact value. So we have it in our Shopify channels, our Amazon channels, they all will be processed. And the same thing holds true for listing management. So the listing management code unit, again, historically or traditionally has been hard-coded to execute any automation routines with the listing MGT default, listing management default code unit ID. And for most CSM installations, this process works just fine. However, the fact that all of the channels by default share the same code unit ID code, it does have the potential to create some issues. Really good example of this would be maybe, say, high order volume environments, especially when multiple sales channels exist in those environments. So let's go with the scenario we have here. I'm selling on Shopify, I'm selling on Amazon, and let's say I'm bringing in a high volume of orders through both my Shopify and my Amazon channels. Because the order management automation routine across these channels share that same code unit ID code, that order MGT default, every time that job queue runs, it's going to attempt to bring in all my orders across all my channels. Um, and if that nets out to be a really large volume of orders, the overall process is going to be kind of slow, and you could potentially see performance issues. So that's a good example. Another one, maybe a little more obscure or niche, but it's relevant, would be a scenario where maybe you're actively having problems or issues with a specific sales channel automation. Um, let's say that there's something wrong, if you will, with my Shopify channel, um, to the point where it causes the order retrieval process to periodically fail. Maybe not every time, but frequently enough to be an issue. Yeah, maybe it's a bad setup. Maybe it's a issue with I've got a customization in there that's causing a problem. Who knows? Um, the problem is that because the job queue, again, is executing against a code unit ID that's shared across all channels, the problem I have with my Shopify channel, it's going to cause the entire process to fail, meaning that not only will I not retrieve my Shopify orders, but my Amazon orders as well. They're using that same code unit ID. So obviously, I mean, ideally, what we want to do is we want to fix our issue in Shopify. But maybe it's a particularly complex issue. Maybe it requires some extensive troubleshooting. We're not going to solve it overnight. Um, we're kind of in a bind right now. What would be really nice would be if we could somehow segregate our problematic Shopify routine to some other process so that, even though if we maybe continue to have problems with our Shopify channel, our Amazon orders can be retrieved in smoothly. Okay, that was a lengthy introduction to CSM automation, scheduling, and the issues surrounding it. Let's now get to the purpose of the video, which is setting up and configuring a job queue for these automation routines. Um, SuiteEngine recently added some new automation code units to CSM that support this ability to set up multiple job queues for automation routines. I have a little table here that I'm going to share um, that has all of kind of the relevant information. So you can see, as always, basically some more supporting two automation routine types, order management and listing management. And in our second column, we have the new, or I guess what I would call now our current code units. Now the third column shows the older code units or the legacy code unit IDs here. I want to stress that there's absolutely nothing wrong with these legacy code units. If you're a current CSM user and you haven't been experiencing any automation issues, you haven't been experiencing any job queue issues, there's absolutely nothing you need to do. The difference between the legacy and the current code units is how they deal with the default code unit ID code shown in this fourth column. The legacy code units were hard-coded to use these defaults. So order MGT default, listing MGT default. The newer or the current code units will still use these values by default, but they also will search out other code unit ID values based on something called a job queue parameter string. That'll make a lot more sense in a few minutes when I show it. But again, what I want to say or reiterate is that if you're a current CSM user and you haven't experienced any issues with your automation, there's no need for you to make any changes. You can pretty much leave everything as is. You can replace your legacy code units with the current ones if you want to. That's fine, but there's nothing wrong with the ones that you're currently working with. Okay, let's go back to our Business Central environment. As you can see, as I've already talked about, in this environment, we have both Shopify and uh, Amazon channels set up. This CSM automation list page shows all the automation routines across all of my channels. Um, each set of routines is, as I mentioned before, channel specific, although there certainly are similarities in function across the channels. You can see that for Amazon, we've got the ability to process FBA channel orders, process FBM channel orders. For Shopify, it's called build sales channel orders, build, things like that. Again, same general concept, even if the descriptions are a little bit different, but they're pretty much doing the same thing. Now, if we look at our code unit ID code field, you can see that all of the automation routines across all of our channels have one of the two default values assigned. By default, when the job queue runs, it will execute against these code unit IDs. You can see, to illustrate this, what we'll do is we'll set up a new job queue entry. So before I do that, take note of our order management defaults. You can see these were last run. Today is February 6th. They were run at 4:27, going into 4:28. Let's now go, and I'm going to search on job queue entries. And I'm going to choose the new action in the ribbon. On my new job queue entry card, I'm going to indicate that I want to run a code unit. And I'm then going to enter the code unit ID for our order management routines. And my caption and description confirm that I've put in the appropriate value. Now, normally there would be additional setup. I would then use the other fields here and on this recurrence fast tab as well to indicate how frequently I want to run this job queue. All of this setup, though, it's just standard Microsoft setup. We'll include a link to Microsoft's documentation on basic job queue entry setup as part of this video. But for our purposes, we don't need to worry about that. We're good to go. Same kind of note with the scheduling. So typically what we would do when we were ready to go is we would set the status to ready. Then that would basically indicate to Business Central to run the job queue automatically according to whatever recurrence we had defined. But again, rather than schedule it for the purposes of this, I'm just going to manually run it once. I'll say yes to this note. And the job queue is now executing against all of our relevant automation routines. And it says we're done. Let's return to our CSM automation list page. And if we take a look at all of our order management default code units, you can see how the last run timestamp has now been updated. Again, it's only those routines that fit the parameters of our scheduled frequency. You can see we actually have a housekeeping routine, also part of the order management, but it's set to trigger every 3 hours and 20 minutes. So that one has not run as part of our latest update. We also have a scheduled listing management default. That one you can see has not updated either. And in terms of the basic setting up of a job queue entry for CSM, that's pretty much all there is to it. Now, if you're working with listing management, you would repeat what I just showed. We set up a order management job queue entry. You do the same thing for the listing management one as well. But in most scenarios, what I've showed will probably be sufficient. I do want to show you, though, how it's possible to set up multiple job queue entries using, again, what we call parameter strings. So let's say that for whatever reason, we want to move our Shopify automation routines to their own dedicated job queue entry. So I'll pick a few of these Shopify routines, and I'm going to update their code unit ID from order management default to let's call it an order management shop. And I'll just copy that to make this easier. We'll do a few more in here. We don't need to do all of them to illustrate our purposes. Okay, we've updated 3. That should be sufficient. Let's now return to our job queue entries. And I'm going to create a second job queue here, job queue entry. Again, indicate it's a code unit and plug in the value for our order automation code unit. This time, however, in this parameter string field, I'm going to enter that unique code unit ID that I just set up. And now I'm going to, again, just do a manual run. Our order automation is complete. And let's return back to our CSM automation list. If we take a look at those automation routines with the new code unit, and we take a look at the last run timestamp, we can see that only these automation routines were run as part of that job queue entry. All of the records still using the default have remained untouched. So in this way, we were able to instruct Business Central to execute a job queue entry against a subset or group of these automation routines. One super quick note I'll just point out, we have this CSM Administrator Role Center that includes all of the basic pages, actions, so on and so forth involving CSM. Some people use it, some people don't. If you are working with this Role Center, we have these dedicated automation buttons, one for order automation, one for listing automation. When you click one of these buttons, it will run all of your order management and listing management routines. These buttons are hard-coded to the default code unit IDs. So be aware that if you do make any changes to your automation routines, if you update the code unit IDs or modify the code unit IDs on any of those automation routines, they will not be included in these buttons when they're used to execute the automation. But other than that, that's it. I guess one note I'll make on this ability we've introduced to set up multiple job queue entries. Our advice on this would be you don't really need to worry about it unless you're finding yourself experiencing issues with your CSM automation. If you're just getting started with CSM, or if you've been working with CSM and everything's been working fine, don't spend the time setting up 6 different job queue entries for order management right off the bat. I would say start with the standard defaults, set up just the one job queue, no parameter string, running the standard default code unit ID. And then if you do ever encounter issues, you can then go from there. But other than that final piece of guidance, there's really nothing else to cover. So thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out our entire video library for more advice on how to set up and use your CSM solution.